The Retort Season 1 presents expert views on the BTWC and CWC and the issues they face. This project is the product of a collaboration between Professor Li-Jun Shang, Professor Malcolm Dando and Dr. Brett Edwards. This initiative has been funded by the London Metropolitan University Rescaling Fund 2021, which was awarded to Professor Li-Jun Shang. We are grateful for this support.
Hello and welcome to this series of talks on the subject of chemical, biological weapon disarmament and non-proliferation. In this series, we will be hearing from a wide range of experts as we look towards the two major review conferences which will be taking place in coming months. In each talk, you will hear from a respected expert who will outline key opportunities and challenges in making pragmatic and holistic progress on this issue globally. This project has been kindly supported by the London Metropolitan University.
Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of The Retort. In this first season, we're going to be looking towards the forthcoming review conferences of the Biological and Chemical Weapons Conventions. To that end, we've got a series of speakers lined up who are going to give you good reviews of various key issues going forward. This will hopefully be of value to those already working within the space, but also those who are now entering it. I really hope this series is of use, and so please do get in touch to give me feedback, or else if you'd want to contribute in some way, we are really eager to get people involved, and seeing how it works out, we'll hopefully extend this to a second season. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. So this first video is going to be primarily an historical overview, which will touch upon issues which will be examined in much greater depth in later shows. We will examine the history of chemical and biological weapons of warfare, as well as the emergence of the chemical and biological weapon prohibition regimes. Industrialization in the 18th and 19th centuries gave rise to increasingly destructive weapon systems which could kill at an industrial scale. This led to an increasing cognizance of the need to place moral limits on warfare. A case in point were chemical weapons. While there was a long history of the use of chemical weapons, such as toxic smokes on a small scale, by the end of the 19th century, broader advances in the chemical industry made a large-scale use of toxic agents increasingly feasible. In response, attempts were made to place largely preemptive limits on the use of poison gases as a weapon of war in a series of international agreements. Most notably, the International Declaration of the Brussels Conference in 1874, as well as the First and Second Hague International Peace Conferences of 1899 and 1907. Concerns about the destructive potentials of chemical warfare came to fruition during the First World War, with the development and widespread use of a range of chemical agents. Initial experiments with industrial chemicals such as chlorine would give way to the development and use of agents such as phosgene and sulfur mustard on a massive scale, which added to the misery of soldiers and long-term suffering of veterans in that war. While this generation of weapons was primarily developed as a means to overcome the deadlock of trench warfare, other uses would be found for them following the armistice. Embryonic biological programs would also proliferate, with as many as 5 states identified as having active programs at some point in this era. The destructive potentials of chemical and biological warfare were not lost on those involved in global disarmament drives in the intervening years between the First and Second World Wars. This was reflected in the inclusion of a no first use agreement on both chemical and biological weapons in the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which affirmed the condemnation of such weapons by the civilized world. While important in the history of the codification of the norm against biological and chemical warfare, this agreement was limited inasmuch as it did not prevent the development and use of such weapons for retaliatory use or against those not party to the agreement. In addition, reservations entered by states as well as the failures of the US to ratify the treaty in this period certainly served to undermine its credibility, as did continued CBW armament throughout the 1930s, as well as the use and allegations of use of chemical weapons in the wake of World War I. Chemical weapons would be used by a number of colonial powers to quell insurgencies during the interwar years, with horrific consequences for unprotected troops and civilians. While then the immediate impacts of these agreements in the interwar years are not clear-cut, Disarmament drives in this period would provide both inspiration and legitimacy to disarmament drives which would once again take hold in the latter part of the 20th century. During the Second World War, several states continued to expand their chemical and biological warfare capabilities, although the latter was to a much lesser extent. This translated to significant stockpiles of agents such as mustard and phosgene, and in Nazi Germany, by the end of the war, production systems for newly developed nerve agents such as tabun and sarin. The absence of large-scale use of chemical weapons in the West stemmed from a combination of ethical, practical, as well as strategic considerations, as well as fear of retaliation in kind. However, in the Eastern Theatre, where China lacked either deterrent capabilities or defences, Japan would engage in both biological and chemical warfare in Manchuria. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, states continued to expand research and development of biological and chemical weapons, work which would also draw upon data from Japanese and Nazi programs. The first half of the 20th century witnessed the establishment of offensive development and production programs, as well as an ever-growing list of agents refined and tested for use in conflict, including a new generation of nerve agents. It was also a period in which these agents became marked out and distinguished from other forms of weapons in technical, ethical, and doctrinal terms. Following the Second World War, programs continued to proliferate, and there was a significant expansion of stockpiles, as well as research and development into a wide range of agents with a broad range of purposes, including incapacitation, area denial, and assassination. This included significant work involving open-air trials and human research subjects, which was, and to varying extents still is, subject to secrecy. The use of herbicidal weapons in the 1950s and 1960s, including most notoriously the use of Agent Orange in Vietnam, would also serve to reassert the broader potentials of chemical and biological weapons as an environmental weapon. It was also during this period that broader public opposition to these weapons began to solidify in Western states. This armament drive led ultimately to the establishment of two fundamentally interrelated prohibition treaty regimes, which would become the centerpieces of broader drives toward global biological and chemical disarmament and non-proliferation, the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention. Drives towards comprehensive biological and chemical warfare prohibition treaties would also be supplemented by additional multilateral measures designed to deter use and prevent proliferation. This includes, most notably, the UN Secretary-General's investigative mechanism, established in the 1980s, to enable prompt investigations into chemical and biological weapon use, as well as the UN Security Council Resolution 1540, which established a committee to facilitate national implementation and international cooperation in the areas of nuclear, chemical, and biological non-proliferation. This is in addition to a patchwork of other export control agreements. In the following section, the history of these two centerpiece regimes, the BTWC and the CWC, are reviewed in further detail. While it is common today to distinguish between biological and chemical weapons, it is worth noting at this point there are in fact significant overlaps between these two categories of agent. As a result, certain weapon agents, the so-called mid-spectrum agents, are today covered by both treaties. This includes several naturally occurring toxins such as ricin and bioregulators. Indeed, such is this overlap that at some points in history it was conceivable that a single CB prohibition treaty might emerge. However, during the late 1960s, a UK-led initiative led to the decision to pursue two distinct treaties. This decision then, in which the Biological Weapon Treaty was pursued first, reflected the pathway of least resistance. The Biological and Toxin Weapon Convention was signed in 1972 and came into force in 1975. The text of the convention has 15 articles. Some articles are prescriptive, whereas others point to the need for positive actions to be taken by states. A key component of the functioning of the Biological Toxin Weapons Convention since its establishment has been periodic review conferences. The evolution of the Biological Toxin Weapons Convention can be broken down into a number of distinct periods. The first period covers the Cold War from 1975 to 1990. During this time, the treaty largely languished, even in the context of a series of allegations of treaty violations. More significant proved to be the Sevast Anthrax Leak of 1979, which revealed, at least in part, the extent of Soviet biological warfare activities, which had continued to expand since the signing of the treaty. Even in this fractured context, however, incremental developments, most notably the agreement of further confidence-building measures in the 1980s, which were designed to increase state reporting of relevant information, demonstrated the continued utility of the treaty. In addition, another important diplomatic practice that became established in this period was the use of review conferences to seek, develop, and acknowledge additional areas of agreement. The second period runs from 1991 to 2001, and during this time there were three key areas of development. The first was a failed attempt to strengthen the convention with the addition of a verification protocol. Since this time, states have been ostensibly split on the question of whether protocol negotiations should be revived. The second key area of development was the uncovering of the extent of the Iraqi and South African programs, as well as the acknowledgement by Russia of the previous non-compliance of the USSR with the convention. Finally, during this period, there were increasing levels of concern about sub-state acquisition of chemical and biological weapons. The third time period starts in around 2000 and takes us up to the present day. In the context of the crisis generated by the failure of states to negotiate the Treaty Verification Protocol, an agreement emerged between states on the need for more regular meetings. This led to the establishment of what is known as the intersessional process. These processes centre on annual meetings of experts as well as annual meetings of states parties. There have been 4 intersessional processes since then. The first round, from 2000 to 2005, which was primarily a rescue mission intended to maintain the process of dialogue. The second, from 2007 to 2010, which was characterised as an attempt to revitalise the regime. A key area of progress was the formal establishment of an implementation support unit to support the day-to-day administration of the treaty. The third intersessional process ran from 2012 to 2015, and the outputs demonstrated broad consensus on the importance of the treaty and the need to develop it, but lacked meaningful consensus on practical steps to be taken. The fourth intersessional process, which ran from 2017 to 2021, focused on 5 thematic areas. This included cooperation and assistance for promoting the peaceful use of life sciences, review of scientific and technological advances, national implementation, preparedness and assistance in the case of alleged use of biological weapons, as well as institutional strengthening. It is yet unclear as to the extent to which these processes will feed into practical outcomes at the forthcoming review conference. A recent development, which will also have longer-term impacts on the regime, is a decision by Russia to launch a formal consultative mechanism under the auspices of Article 5 of the treaty. This is in relation to a range of as-of-yet unsubstantiated allegations it has made during its invasion of Ukraine. This is an issue which I hope to explore in greater detail as it unfolds. The CWC would come into force some 20 years after the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention. During the intervening period, not only did a significant number of states continue to develop and stockpile these weapons, but they were also used, with devastating effect during the Iraq-Iran war. These events were significant in securing broader public support for the Convention. The Convention, under Article 1, allows for the controlled, peaceful use of toxic chemicals. However, it prohibits the development, production, stockpiling, transfer and use of chemical weapons under any circumstances. States parties are also prohibited from engaging in military preparations to use chemical weapons or in assisting others to do so. In addition, Article 1 also requires that all existing stocks of chemical weapons and relevant facilities are destroyed. Historically, the central focus of the OPCW, the CWC's implementing body, has been the identification and destruction of existing chemical weapon arsenals and production facilities around the world. However, with the anticipated elimination of all declared chemical weapons stockpiles in the near future, the OPCW is increasingly focused on a broad range of activities aimed at preventing the re-emergence of chemical weapons. The Conference of State Parties is the principal decision-making organ of the OPCW and oversees the implementation of the Convention. There is also a review conference held every 5 years to comprehensively examine the operations of the Convention and determine the strategic direction of its implementation body. The first and second review conferences focused primarily on the expensive and technically demanding issue of destruction. These conferences also reasserted the need for universalisation of the treaty, as well as its role in combating terrorism. The third review conference, held in 2013, and the fourth review conferences in 2018 occurred in the context of the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian civil war. These meetings were notable in that they emphasised the central importance of the regime in the destruction of Syrian chemical weapons stockpiles. The review conferences were also notable in that they reflected an opening up of the regime to more public engagement with civil society at the review conferences.
However, recent developments, most notably related to the fallout of chemical weapon use in Syria, as well as the Skripal and Navalny assassination attempts involving nerve agents, will create a challenging environment in which bounded agreements will need to be sought. We are currently at a pivotal moment in the history of the global prohibition against biological and chemical weapons. In addition to changes brought about by developments in science and technology, the changing character of conflict is an important driver in this issue area. Throughout the 21st century, biological and chemical weapons were developed for a range of purposes. The specific needs of a given conflict, as well as more general trends in conflict, may lead to shifts in the calculations of states and nefarious actors, and result in actions which violate or otherwise weaken and undermine the categorical prohibition against these weapon systems. In response, there is a continued need for civil society and states to work to facilitate meaningful agreements to ensure the maintenance of the global prohibition of biological and chemical weapons. This requires the adoption of a pragmatic and holistic approach. There is no single disarmament agreement or point of political consensus that can guarantee against the development and use of these weapon systems. Neither is there a way to guarantee that the institutions we work on today will not need repair and renewal tomorrow. Instead, then, we must accept that the maintenance of the norm against biological and chemical weapons is an active process, with both political and technical problems having to be solved again and again. Personal and professional dedication is required to help ensure the continued political relevance of international institutions and agreements, which, although often imperfect, are hard-won. A key aim in this series, then, is to keep the conversation going by pointing to realistic and practical steps which might be taken now to help protect the norm against biological and chemical weapons for future generations.